Professor Wergelis here. We've talked about it before, but the more we talk about it, the better you're going to understand so you can get that good grade on the exam. Now, what's the main difference between JavaScript and the DOM? You can guarantee this is going to be a test question. JavaScript is a programming language. It's a language that the browser reads and does stuff with. But the DOM is where that stuff happens. I can access the DOM with another language besides JavaScript. JavaScript is just the default scripting language for the web. It's a default scripting language for HTML. I can use other scripting languages like PHP, Perl, Python, Ruby. It doesn't matter what language it is. Right now we're using JavaScript to access the DOM. I can use Python to access the DOM. I can use PHP to access the DOM. Any scripting language can access the DOM, but JavaScript is the default scripting language for the web that the browser reads and does so with, but the DOM is where that stuff happens. So what the heck is Professor Wergelis talking about? In fact, a lot of what you might think as a JavaScript thing is more accurately a DOM API thing. For instance, we can write JavaScript that watches for a mouse enter event on an element or an on-click event. But that element is really a DOM node. We can add a listener to the DOM property of the DOM node. When that event happens, it's the DOM node that emits the event, that triggers the event, thus calling a JavaScript function. So all the times where you might say, oh, this is JavaScript, this is JavaScript, most likely it's the DOM, and we're using JavaScript to access the DOM, or the DOM is calling JavaScript. So it's almost like there is a man in the middle. I have JavaScript over here. The DOM is in the middle, and then I have my HTML contents. JavaScript can be switched out. I could use Python, PHP, Perl, Ruby to access the DOM, then to change the HTML elements. So the JavaScript is just a scripting language that's accessing the DOM, that's triggering and changing the HTML elements. So let's say I click on an HTML element. That onClick function is in the DOM API that then goes and calls a script language, which in this case so happens to be JavaScript, but can technically be any other scripting language. So I have JavaScript that communicates with the DOM, and the DOM then modifies or updates the HTML elements. So let's take a look again at changing HTML content. Here's the example we saw before. Here's the JavaScript. So one might think, oh, this is in the script tag, so all of this is JavaScript. Technically, JavaScript is the programming language, but I could use any other script here like PHP, Python, Ruby to also do the same thing. So JavaScript's the programming language. I'm accessing the DOM. I'm using the DOM's method called getElementById, which takes one parameter. If the ID is available, I'm then accessing the inner HTML property using the DOM to change the text of the element. So here I have JavaScript. JavaScript's calling the DOM. From the DOM, I'm calling the method getElementById. The DOM goes and checks, is there an element with ID equal to P1? Yes, there is. Now, I'm using the inner HTML property of the DOM and changing the contents of the HTML element to say new text instead of hello world. And JavaScript is calling the DOM to do this. Okay, so I actually have 3 layers there. Here, the document does contain a paragraph tag with ID equal to P1. The DOM is getting the element with ID equal to P1, and the DOM is changing the content of that element to new text. So let's make sure we're clear on this. JavaScript is a language used to access the DOM, and the DOM changes the content of that element to new text. Okay, so on an exam, this is what you'd want to say. The HTML document contains a paragraph tag with ID equal to P1. We're using the DOM to get the element with ID equal to P1. JavaScript is the language used to access the DOM, and the DOM changes the content, the inner HTML of that element to new text. Okay, so here's JavaScript. JavaScript's calling the DOM, finding the element with ID equal to P1, and changing the inner HTML to new text using JavaScript. So here's a good example. Let's say I right-click on Wikipedia. Here's document object model, that's the DOM. I right-click, and you'll see here I have an H1. Okay, the H1, remember this is HTML code. I have the HTML code on my local machine. I then load that into the browser. The browser renders that page. What do I mean by renders that page? It takes the contents of that page one by one. So it goes sequentially line by line, reads all the contents, loads that into the browser as a document object model, which is that tree thing that we looked at before. So now you have this tree, and the first one is the HTML element. In the HTML, I have the head. Head has a title. Title has a text. Then I have the body. Inside the body, here is the H1. Okay, so here's my document object model. You'll see I'm trying to, let's say, add an event listener. So the document is a DOM thing. And when I call get element by ID looking for first heading, that's another DOM thing. And let's say I want to add a listener, a mouse enter. So I have a DOM property that's allowing us to watch for events called event listener. Okay, it's called mouse enter. Once this particular DOM event is fired, is triggered, the DOM emits the event and calls this JavaScript function. You'll see the function just prints out the mouse enter. So even though this is JavaScript, the syntax, the language, document is referencing the DOM. Get element by ID is a DOM method. We'll have a DOM property here called add event listener. We're looking for a particular listener called mouse enter. Once this happens, this JavaScript function will be triggered, and then we'll print to the console the mouse entered. So I have those three elements here. I have JavaScript, the DOM, HTML. Okay, I'm using JavaScript to access the DOM to get an element by ID equal to first heading. So the DOM goes to the HTML page, looks for first heading, it finds it. Now I want to set the property, add event listener, mouse event. So I set the property. Once the mouse event triggers, the DOM will emit an event, which will then call a JavaScript function. So I have three stages here. Okay, and the DOM is technically the middleman. It's the interface, which is exactly what the definition states. So every time you see JavaScript, is it really JavaScript or is it the DOM? That depends if you're looking at the keyword document. Every time you see the keyword document, I'm referencing the DOM, and most likely everything that follows is going to be a DOM thing versus a JavaScript thing. But not always the case. You really need to look at it. We know what the DOM methods are, what the properties are, and then you need to verify what's going on there. As far as the exam, you're going to see a similar example as what we just looked at. You're going to see an element. I'm going to try to grab the ID, change the inner HTML, and you're going to want to tell me what's going on there. So hopefully you get the point. The DOM is a document object model of all HTML elements and attributes of a web page, defined in your code, but loaded and created in the browser after the DOM has finished executing. The DOM is where everything happens. It's the lifeblood. It's the center of the web page application. It's where everything goes down in the browser. If something happens, most likely it's in the DOM. JavaScript is just the syntax. It's a language. It can be replaced. We can use Python, PHP, Ruby, Perl. Doesn't matter. JavaScript is just the default scripting language. It can be used totally outside the browser with no APIs at all. Like if we take a look at Node.js. JavaScript and the DOM are two independent things. If I'm using Node, it has nothing to do with the DOM, and that's why it's a specific language. But JavaScript can be used to access the DOM, which is where everything goes down, which is where everything happens, and that's how things are going to be changed, things are going to be loaded based off the DOM. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I have three elements. I have JavaScript, I have the DOM, I have HTML. The DOM is the middleman. JavaScript calls the DOM to change the HTML. HTML fires an event, says, hey, I've been clicked on. DOM then goes and calls a JavaScript method. Okay, so the DOM is the middleman in between the HTML and the JavaScript. HTML can be changed. We could use XML. And JavaScript can be changed. We could use Python. But the DOM is the center point of the application. I'm hoping that's clear. If not, reach out to me. We're here to help. The TAs are here to help. We want you to get this, and we want you to get a good grade in this class. So reach out to me if you have any questions. Stick with Professor Wergeles. We're going to open up some code. We're going to take a look at some examples. We're going to access form data using JavaScript, using the DOM, and we'll go over more examples so it's crystal clear for the exam. We'll see you in the next video.